So, Nicholas, among other things, you've written a book called David Bowie in Darkness, a study of one outside and the late career. And I was wondering, just to begin, if you could tell me how this project got started.
I did my master's thesis on David Bowie and his album Outside that came out in 1995. And so that's where this particular project started. I remember earlier than I did my master's in 1998 at McMaster University, and music criticism was the program. And I remember listening to the album when it came out in 95 and sort of really wanting to know what was going on in the album and trying to solve some of the riddles that were in it, both musically and I guess thematic riddles that were there. And so I thought, oh, I would really like to spend some time looking at this, and I had the opportunity to do that at McMaster with Susan Fast. And then as time went on, of course, this is almost what would it be, 15 years ago or so. I thought, well, let me take a look at this material again. And so I revisited it and of course expanded it and updated it to include much of Bowie's later career, an area of study that very few people look at. There are some people that have looked at Bowie, post 1983, but I think once Let's Dance comes around in the early 80s, most people sort of wrote him off, and I didn't want to do that. So that's sort of the start of that work.
As you said, it took many years of going back and forth between different things I'm sure you were working on, but it ended up coming out, I believe, the year that he died, right?
It came out in June of 2015, and he died in January 2016. And then I sort of it had a resurgence of popularity. That's probably too strong a word, but certainly it. I worked a lot on it in 2014, I think it was, and I didn't know what the future was going to be. I mean, the new album Black Star hadn't even been released, or there wasn't even any sort of glimmer of that showing up when I was writing the book. There were a couple of singles that were out at the time, and I just sort of glanced at them. I spent a page, I think, talking about both of them. I feel like I want to write something else because I think that as a text, Black Star is really, really rich. But I don't know if I'll get a chance to do that or not. Hopefully in the future I will.
I know the future was uncertain, of course, for Bowie, and I don't think very many people at all, because of his choice not to make his illness public, or at least not to very many people. I don't think a lot of people saw it coming. And so where did you think Bowie's career might have gone, and how did that change after his death?
I thought it would go similar in a similar trajectory as it had been going at that time, right? There was this whole sort of period between 2003 and 2013. I think it was pretty much 10 years where there wasn't much from him. He had appeared on Arcade Fire's album. A little bit before that, he appeared live in concert with a few other bands and so forth, but he was pretty silent. And I thought that maybe that's what he was going to do, that he would release one or two songs here or there and not really do any major work. The Next Day came out in 2013, I think, was the year, and that was a big surprise for most fans because he came out of what seemed to be retirement to do this. But still, with the release of the two tracks, I guess it was Sue and the other track that escapes me right now, but the release of those two tracks before Black Star, well before Black Star, as singles, I think sort of signaled to me that he would be just releasing these one-offs or a couple of tracks here or there. But it was exciting music for me. It was pushing what he had done in the past. It was quite different from even The Next Day. It was much more avant-garde, and so that's what I was expecting him to do. Part of me was really looking forward to his new music, thinking that it would harken back to all the work I had done with Outside, and sort of really pushing the envelope for what was even acceptable for mainstream pop music.
When you were thinking about this particular period of Bowie, how, or I should say, who helped you think about this in terms of theorists or in terms of maybe other writers? When you're approaching the work of Bowie or someone like Bowie, what have you found to be most helpful?
When I was doing my master's degree itself, I was looking at Victor Turner, and some of his theories about liminality, of course, but also some of the things on ritual that he talks about. And I went back to some of that when I relooked at Outside and some of his work. Um, so that was the major theorist that I had looked at. But when I continued on in my doctoral work, I I wrote my doctorate on Morrissey, another singer, and I talked about him as an enigmatic celebrity. And part of that study looked to Roland Barthes, and that was my sort of beginning of love of Roland, of everything sort of Roland Barthes. So I'm a Barthesian theorist, is how I like to call myself. No one else seems to want to call me that, but I'm trying my best to sort of label myself that way. And so I found that some of his writing, he's got a book called SZ that lots of people really like, and I think I don't love the book, but it's been sort of a life changer for me because in that book, he talks about desire and how a reader sort of flips the pages. You know, how the writer creates this world where people want to find out what's happening and what's going to happen on the next page, and so it keeps us reading. And I find that very useful in terms of understanding enigma and the popular music celebrity. And so when we look at David Bowie and we see that he was away from the spotlight for 10 years, I immediately want to take a look at Roland Barthes because it's in his ideas regarding sort of desire and following the mystery that we can understand a little bit about why we might want to continue listening to Bowie. And I think with Black Star coming out and with Bowie's death, I think that there's all kinds of stuff to look at with Roland Barthes in particular because he talks so much about death as well. And there's this whole world that I didn't even get to explore really um, when I was doing the book on Bowie, applying some of Barthes' theories because of Barthes' ideas regarding death and what is going on there as well. Death, memory, nostalgia, all of these things that are so intertwined, I think, with what Bowie was doing right at the end of his life with Black
I
Star.
mean, with Roland Barthes and Death of the Author, there's this idea, I guess, that a lot of the interpretation is where meaning is really found, right? I mean, there's lots you could say about his work. How do you approach David Bowie as an author, or do you approach him as an author, and how does Bart help you do that?
Well, the thing that's interesting about Barthes and Death of the Author is that, of course, he said that, and then we all know that it's Roland Barthes who said it.
Hmm.
Right? He's not the one. Roland Barthes doesn't really die in any of these studies. He's still sort of firmly attached to the work that he has put forward. So that's sort of an ironic thing there. I think David Bowie is an author. I think he exists. I just don't think we know who the real David Bowie is, just like any other celebrity. We don't have access to who that actually is. And so we get a face value Bowie, if you will. I think Roland Barthes helps us with that because he in many ways he understands that there is an arm's length relationship between us and the texts that we enjoy. We don't get to understand the author in ways that we might want to, but that's still why that's probably still why we listen to this music or why we read these books. We want to get to know the author, even though perhaps it's a fool's game because the author is dead. I understand that when I look at David Bowie, I'm giving somebody a particular reading of what I see in Bowie's music, or my perception of what's going on, and hopefully I've created a compelling argument for why I think this way or that way about Bowie's music. But I'm also really excited with what Bowie's star image is. Like that's part of what I think is interesting is this construction. Who is this person? Not only who the real Bowie is. I mean, I understand I'll never get to know the real Bowie, but I want to know this construction too. And I think that's kind of interesting. I have a weird relationship with a fictional entity, and I think that's much like Roland Barthes' relationship with Proust's characters as well in some of those books. So yeah, it's a weird relationship I have with Bowie and with applying Roland Barthes' work too, but I find it endlessly fascinating.
Well, I mean, definitely of all the people you could have written about, David Bowie is one of the most probably intriguing because of all the things you've just said about his either split personality between he and the personas that he's had.
Hmm.
I'm curious whether you would see Bowie So you sort of made a distinction earlier about David Bowie, the real person, if you will, and David Bowie, the celebrity. Do you see that as a sort of split, like as a duality or two beings, or do you see David Bowie as a multiplicity of almost infinite beings? You know, he's had different persona over the years, as you talk about, and he's had different interpretations, of course, of him and his work as an individual and as a celebrity. But I'm curious about whether you make a distinction between the real Bowie and the celebrity Bowie, or are there more personalities than that?
That's a really interesting question. I think first of all, I would say that there is this duality. There is the real Bowie that none of us will ever understand. Perhaps those that are very close to him, his family might know who that is, but I'm not sure there are very many people in the world at all past that sort of inner circle that know the real Bowie. The rest of us get a picture of Bowie, and I suspect that the celebrity Bowie can then be broken up into, a multiple Bowies, or almost an infinite number of Bowies, because we all experience him differently. But there was something interesting that I found as I was doing some of my research. I had the opportunity to talk briefly to Reeves Gabrels, who was Bowie's guitarist during the 1990s, and I call Gabrels a kind of architect of that music back then. And he suggested that Bowie was not someone who sort of split into multiple personalities, or the common way of talking about Bowie is that he's a chameleon that changed his image all the time. And Gabrels really thought that wasn't the case. He thought that the only constant was Bowie himself, and that what was happening was that the people around him, the tools that he had access to, those things were changing. And so he was the perfect sort of curator of information and of art and of technique and so forth. He would bring all of this stuff together to create new art. And I found that really fascinating. I mean, I didn't buy it completely because, again, I think that there were all of these persona that even Bowie would acknowledge, that Ziggy Stardust, Thin White Duke, and so forth. But I really liked the idea that Bowie was the constant. I mean, I think I would still say Bowie might have been the constant. We just don't know what that was. It was just this big bag of flux or whatever. There was no way to pin what David Bowie, the celebrity, really was. We couldn't define it very well. And I think that's why I really enjoyed a lot of the stuff that came out after his death. There was a performance that was done on the Brit Awards, a tribute by Lord, as well as the some of the band members that played with Bowie in 2003, and that was a very well received performance. Critics really loved that. And then there was the Lady Gaga performance that was on the Grammys, and critics didn't really care for that performance and thought that it was too sort of commercial and so forth. But I thought those two things, if you looked at them together, it was perfect. It really didn't define Bowie at all. On one hand, we had this crazy over commercialized Lady Gaga performance that was brought to us by Intel, and then on the other side, you had Lord that did this sort of very emotional and heartfelt sort of remembrance on the Brit Awards. And I thought, what a great juxtaposition. Two people that were quite different, two performances that seemed to be on both sides of both ends of the spectrum, if you will. But that's how Bowie would have liked it, because we can't pin him down.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of the, I think it's a 2007 film, I'm Not There, about Bob Dylan.
I saw some of that. I haven't seen it all, but I certainly I know what you're talking about there.
Yeah, I mean, well, in that one, they have different actors portray him at, I guess, different times in his life, right? Like, there's Heath Ledger was in that.
Kate Blanchett was in that playing him, which is quite funny.
Yeah, so there were a number of people, and I mean, do you think that's something about a lot of performers who have been able to last, I guess, in popular culture, like Dylan and like Bowie, that they have these changing multiple personas that could be, if you needed to represent them, they would be represented by a lot of different diverse actors in a movie, for example? Or is that something that's still relatively rare? I mean, how do you think he fits into that?
Well, I think it's relatively rare, and I'm not sure if it's changing personas or if it's simply a masked persona. That we don't really know what's going on. That the performer is never under our thumb, so to speak. we can't nail them down. And I think that's probably more accurate, at least in my mind. I mean, Dylan has had his periods of music. We characterize various periods by certain themes and so forth in Bob Dylan's music, and perhaps ways that he presented himself. But I think the most common way that Dylan presented himself was not as Robert Zimmerman.
Hmm.
And I think the same thing happens with David Jones. I mean, we don't see that person at all. We see David Bowie throughout. I think what makes David Bowie a little more complex is that we see him at one point as Ziggy Stardust, or at one point Thin White Duke, or another point as, you know, Detective Nathan Adler in Outside. You know, so and then now we see David Bowie as the guy who died. But, you know, Black Star, we don't see, at least I don't see Black Star as made by David Bowie when he was alive. In many ways, when I listen to Black Star now, I'm listening to David Bowie after he's dead, because the album seems so related to his death. I mean, he died a couple of days after the album was released. So I can't separate those two. So that's also fascinating for me. But I think it's not so much changing persona in my mind anyway. It's more that we don't get to see the real Dylan or the real Bowie. And it's pretty rare. I mean, Dylan is a great example of this kind of enigmatic celebrity. Stephen Patrick Morrissey is another great example too.
Hmm. Well, like you said, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to pin him down or to pin his who he truly is down.
Yeah,
Nevertheless, though, you wrote a book about Bowie.
I did.
I find it interesting because as a writer, I would be really intimidated to try to write a book about someone, even about myself, but definitely about someone else. And but as a reader, I love to read autobiographies and biographies. How do you approach theoretically writing about someone who, as you said, you can't really pin down?
Well, what I find fascinating is the notion of mediation. So there's always something between me and whoever I'm writing about. And in many ways, what I'm writing is my reaction or my thoughts about that particular person. So, you know, someone might take a look at my book and say, well, I don't really agree at all. And I guess I'm a good enough postmodernist to say that's fine. Hopefully my arguments here are compelling enough to sound reasonable to you. But if you don't buy them, that's fine. But this is how I have seen this particular artist. This is how I read David Bowie as a text, through these layers of mediation. And I think that's how I approach it. And I would challenge anybody that because of the layers of mediation between me and the celebrity, you know, good luck trying to pin anything down. Let's continue to work to create some image, and then maybe as we gather enough of these images, we might be able to find something that sticks. But that's perhaps that's not going to happen.
Well, like you said, if you are somewhat of a postmodernist and you're trying to understand this person and his mediated representations, what is the objective if it's not to find the real Bowie? What is your objective in this?
Well, it's to find the real Bowie, but I know that I can't find all of him. So I'm trying to find something of the real Bowie. You know, with my colleagues, we often talk about truth and, you know, our work always, you know, searching for truth and so forth. And it seems pretty esoteric to talk like that. But in many ways, I don't mind speaking like that, because I sort of think, well, I'm going to try to find that nugget of truth, that little, you know, grain of sand of truth that I can. I might not be able to find it, but I'm going to try. I'm going to at least move towards truth. So even if I can't pin Bowie down, hopefully there will be something that I can get out of my study. And somebody else might take a look at it and say, oh, you know, that little grain of sand of truth there, that seems to ring true for me as well. And then we can maybe put a flag in that little grain of sand. And that's one thing that we figured out. We've at least moved towards some kind of truth. And yeah, that's really my project.
So you're not 100% into postmodernism, then it sounds like.
Well, I think I would probably call myself more of a postmodernist. I mean, I think I am a product of the air that I have breathed, and that air is postmodernism. So I think I'm I've never thought of myself as a conditional postmodernist. How about that? Uh, I'm not a conditional postmodernist. I mean, do I think that everything is relative? No, I think that that's a misconstruction of what postmodernism is. Is that a word, by the way? Misconstruction? See, I'm a good postmodernist because I make up words,
Yeah, I mean, there's no
right?
reason it couldn't be, right? Um,
Right.
well, do you see Roland Barthes as a postmodernist? I know he's often lumped into as a post-structuralist, and
Yeah.
then there's a debate. And
Hmm.
then I suppose he could be used as one or by one, regardless of whether he is one. But
Right.
well, I guess what I should say is, what is a Barthesian?
A Bartesian is anyone who takes comfort in looking at Roland Barthes' theories and finds something useful there, I would say. Roland Barthes talked about texts, and some of those texts he called writerly texts, the kinds of texts that the reader, while reading, rewrites. And I think if we take that idea, I think lots of our celebrities are writerly texts. When we read them, we rewrite them as well. I'm in my book on Bowie. In many ways, I am creating Bowie as well. My work contributes to that. You know, it's not that I am not, it's not only that I'm trying to find that little nugget of truth, but in many ways I'm muddying the waters as well, because I'm throwing more another definition onto him. So I like that idea from Roland Barthes, the notion of a readerly text that or I should say, a writerly text that we in fact create meaning as we're reading Bowie. Is Barthes a postmodernist? In my mind, he is, only because he's not certain of anything, and I think that's except for the authors that he really enjoys. But certainly in his analyses, I don't think he's particularly certain of anything.
Mhm.
He's more playful than he is serious, and he's happy to go back on what he thought and revise some of his thinking. And so I really like Roland Barthes for that. I think he defines a lot of my ways of looking at texts, and maybe that's fundamentally why I'm a Barthesian, because of how I look at the text. There is so much potential in the reading of a text, and there's so much in there that people haven't understood. And this, before me, I'm the unique one to bring something new from the text,
Mhm.
and that makes these texts alive. Bowie died, in January of last year, but he's alive because I'm listening to him and rewriting him and recreating him, and in many ways, I'm resurrecting him as well every time I put that record on.
And well, like you said, there are so many ways that you can do a reading or multiple
Yeah.
readings of him and his work as a text, either
Hmm.
taken together or in various parts or periods of his work. Um, I'd like to hear a little bit about your process. How would you encourage someone who wants to do a project like that to look at a text or a collection of texts by an author potentially as complicated and complex and polysemic really as David Bowie? That can be a really intimidating thing that I think a lot of people would back away from and then go towards something that's at least a little bit clearer.
Sure.
And maybe it didn't work like this, but I imagine you sit down and you say, okay, I'm going to write a dissertation, or I'm going to write a book, or I'm going to explore this really complicated artist. What do you do after that?
What I do is I find something that hooks me. I guess I'm using another Barthesian term. He talks in his discussions about photography. He talks about a punctum, the thing that
Hmm.
pricks you from the photograph, and it's something that you can't codify. It's something that you find difficult to actually write down. Once you figure out why it might prick you, then it's no longer something that pricks you. So you throw it away or whatever. I think it's that punctum in the music or in the text, that the thing that really gets you, that hooks onto you.
Hmm.
I remember in undergrad talking to one of my professors at University of Ottawa about listening to this album from Bowie outside in 1995 and saying, this is really interesting. And she said, well, the first thing to do is to find that thing that grabs your attention. And so that's what I would do. What I would tell a student is find that thing that fascinates you. Consider it a problem that you have to solve. And so, once you know the problem you want to solve, then you could continue on from there and try to figure out if there are tools that will help you to solve that problem. But that's how I would approach it. The thing that hooks you, or the thing that you find interesting, the thing that's problematic in what you're looking at. what you're reading. And maybe some might be tempted to go to another text that maybe it doesn't appear to be so complex. But I suspect that there are levels of complexity in other texts as well. We might not notice that they are as complex as they are until we really look into them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that everything has infinite levels of complexity, but certainly even those sort of pop cultural icons or things that we see around us that we might throw away because they are too ingrained in popular culture, those things might be quite complex as well. And certainly our relationship with those artifacts would be complex enough. So that's what I would say, is
Mm-hmm.
to start with that thing that interests you.
Yeah, I think that's something that's not expressed enough
Yeah.
probably to a lot of students, or at least it's not received a lot of the time, because I still find it interesting that people are often surprised when I say to them, they're looking for a research project or an essay topic, and I ask them what they like, and then
Mm.
but they don't consider that something that they could write about.
Yeah, and some of us academics have actually caused some of those troubles with students as well, because I've heard some of my colleagues say, well, I'm not going to study something that I really like, because once I understand it, or once I
Hmm.
delve into it and figure out the magic, then it'll destroy it for me.
Hmm.
Now, in my experience, that's never happened. I just have found a richer relationship with some of the music that I've listened to, or some of the stuff that I've studied. So I'm not sure that's necessarily something to scare us away. That would be, the first thing I would say to students. Find something that you like, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with it. It might as well be something that you're really interested in.
Hmm.
It makes it a richer experience.
Yeah.
I don't think it destroys the magic at all. So
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I think a lot of people, especially if they're working in the field of cultural studies and popular culture in particular,
yeah,
are used to that argument that if I look too much into this,
right, yeah.
that's never ruined anything for me, and it sounds the same for a lot of scholars.
Yeah.
Uh, what tools, though, once you find that punctum, once you realize this is what I'm going to work on, what conceptual tools have you found most useful? I mean, of course, there's some of the work by Barth, but what other tools would you say are available that people might want to check out?
I find that a harder question to answer, because it's it's so difficult to find the tools, or it can be difficult to find the tools. I think the way that I approach my scholarship, it's perhaps a haphazard way of doing things, and my whole academic career will probably be destroyed by the simple statement. I take a look at things that are around me, and I find tools there. Yesterday I'm working on some stuff on a small emerging Irish band called U2, for a project that I'll be doing in a couple of years, and I was just wanting to touch base with it again, and I had some notes beside me on, indulge me, it was Roland Barthes still, but I had some notes there from an article that I had been reading, and I took a look at what the notes that I had taken down, and I thought that might work here. And so in many ways, I think I would encourage people who are listening to try their best to read all kinds of stuff. And you'll find that as you're reading things, there are certain things that you're reading that you'll point to and say, this will work here. In some ways, you're going backwards, right? Some people take a look at the arsenal and say, well, here's a hammer. I'm going to go and find a nail. I think I look at it the other way. I found the nail. I just need to find the hammer. And in some ways, I think that happens a bit by chance. I mean, I've got the privilege of having all kinds of colleagues that I could rely on. So, I've sent notes to my friends and colleagues and said, what do you think about this? Is there a way for me to approach these things? And they've given me some good hints here or there about where to go to sort of find things. But I've had the real fortune of being able to really leisurely look at some theoretical material and find things that I could apply to some of these studies of music. And I think the novel application of things makes what I do quite fun. And I suspect that it would make what students or young scholars do also just equally rewarding.
Hmm.
I did a book review of a book by Paul Virilio a few years ago, and I found that fascinating. I'm like, look at all of this stuff that I was finding when I was reading about Virilio that I could apply to various things. And so, um, so that's how I've found my tools. It's perhaps not the most efficient way of doing things. It's not an easy way of doing things, but it might be a more pleasurable way of finding those tools. It just means that you need to have a little more time to do that, which might mean you need to pace your projects out, or you need to start a little earlier because you don't really know where it'll end up. But I found it quite rewarding.
Yeah, I wonder if you'll agree with me. I've noticed it, at least in my own research, like so for example, I've been doing a lot of work on gangs and their cultural representations for a long time,
Yeah,
but I find it frequently really boring to read about gangs
right,
because I've read so much that I don't get very many new ideas. I often get the same repetition. I feel very bored.
right.
And so what I've noticed I find myself doing is reading about something very different, like a Renaissance artist
Yeah,
or a musician from the 20s or something like that. And I'll ask myself, how might this relate? And especially if it's a theory book or a critical book that looks from an academic perspective, I often find ideas there because there's nothing about gangs for me to think about, and so I ask myself sort of how can I relate that to the subject matter I'm thinking about, and how can I relate that to something else that's seemingly quite disparate. I wonder if you find that, or do you still find that, for example, reading about David Bowie is most helpful when writing about David Bowie? I'm just curious.
well, I did some of that. I did some reading about David Bowie when I wrote about him, just to see what other people were saying and to grab
Hmm.
some facts here and there to sort of, map out how I was going to take a look at Bowie. But I agree with you. I remember in my study of Bowie, I was looking at I remember wanting to uh, expand some thought about some paintings that informed what Bowie was doing in Outside, because he mentions in the liner notes some artists, and so I took a look at those paintings and took a quick look at some catalogs that were available to give some insight into the paintings. And I remember looking at some of the descriptions of the paintings that were in the catalog and saying that's really going to help me in discussing this whole project. I think that what makes my work rewarding, and I would hazard to guess your work as well, is the novel application of this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm talking about Bowie, it doesn't really help me to just go read about Bowie. It does a bit just so that I know something of what other people have done. But, you know, people who are reading me aren't going to care necessarily that I just repeat everything that somebody else has said. But if I actually apply something from someplace that they wouldn't expect into Bowie, I think that really illuminates things for people. It's really interesting to bring these things together. And maybe this is why I'm a bit of a Bartesian as well, because I feel that in Bart's work, he did that too. I mean, he would
Hmm.
do these studies, mythologies, right? Just a string of studies of the strangest things imaginable, the famous one being soap.
Hmm.
That to actually do an academic sort of study of what soap means, or what tomato sauce means, or whatever. This is pretty novel stuff, and I think that's what makes it exciting. It makes it exciting, and in some ways, it makes the work um, accessible. Not because I'm using concepts or ideas that are easy, but because the reader is relying on me to give them some information about what I'm applying. In other words, they don't need to know it either. I'm going to bring it to them, and I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, and that's probably something that we have to work on in terms of the public image of I think for my work, critical studies, cultural studies, is that it on some level it's something you don't need to know. It's not something that is the same as a tax form or
Right?
a guide to how to assemble your table or something.
Yeah.
These are things that you need to know, and there pretty much is a right answer to a lot of these things. But in finding out all of these things you don't need to know necessarily, you do, I think, get a much bigger, vaster understanding of how the world works, which is something you do need to know.
Yeah, I think so. And I was on Facebook. I'm part of a Facebook group that sort of one of these fan groups for David Bowie, and one of the people on the group was commenting on my book, and I watched sort of with eager uh, wanting to eagerly watching what he was going to type, and he didn't care for the introduction because it was getting complex, and he thought that and I fair enough. But the thing is, the reader confused complexity uh, with sloppiness. And of course,
Hmm.
I didn't like that description so much. Now, again, it could have been sloppy. That's quite possible. I've been known to be a sloppy writer at times. But what was sad, I think, is that the reader decided to put it down and not go back to it for a time. And I think that uh, what I've been able to take from my study of other writers, Roland Barthes, for instance, is that there are things that we can take from him and there are things that we can throw away. And so if there's something that I don't want to use, I don't have to. But there's still something there in that text that's useful. And I hope that my reader will see that my readers will see that. If there's something that doesn't seem to really work, I've got a section in my book about body modification that I cut down quite a bit because it doesn't really need to be there for this discussion. But I hope that a reader will look at it and say, well, that's, I could see why Greco put that in here, but I don't really see its worth. So I'm just going to skip over it, or I'm just going to skim through it. That's the greatest thing I learned from Roland Barthes, is that skimming is okay.
Hmm.
In Pleasure of the Text, he talks about going through a book and just sort of, not worrying too much about what's there. And I think that's something that maybe we don't stress enough either. You don't have to accept everything. It's not, my book is not a tax form. You don't have to accept the whole thing. Hopefully, there's something within it that will shed some light, if you will, shed some truth or whatever onto this image that we have, sort of maybe arrest a little bit of it so that we could understand it a little bit better. And in turn, it's not too great of a jump to say, once I understand a little bit about David Bowie, I might understand a little bit more about life. It sounds stupid to make that connection, but I don't think it is. I think that it's fundamentally important for us in cultural studies to continue the work that we do, because the stuff that we're looking at is part of the texture, the fabric of our lives. And I think that once we understand that, we understand a little bit more of what our lives are all about.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I think it's interesting because as I was reading your book, I didn't know at the beginning what I wanted to get from it
Right,
necessarily. And I also didn't know at the time, as I was reading, whether or not the words I was at that moment would be the ones I remembered or the ones that are
right,
most important.
right.
Uh, but then it's something that only happens after doing that.
Hmm.
In other words, yeah, the idea of going to a text immediately and saying, this is what I want to achieve from reading this is not something that's easy to do in a lot of the critical studies and cultural theory texts that are out there.
Right.
But if you did know that, then they wouldn't really be what they are, right? They wouldn't really
Yeah.
be providing what it is they're providing if they were easy to understand and written in a way that everyone would know exactly what they were going to get beforehand.
Sure. I mean, it's like Roland Barthes' idea about the punctum again. I mean, he takes a look at a picture and he says, if you take a look at a picture and you say, well, this is why I'm going to remember this, then that's not why you're going to remember it. Like, that's not the thing. It's not going to be a good photograph for you. But if you remember it 2 weeks later and you say, boy, that child's collar was something that I remember now, and that's emotional for you or whatever. That's not something that you went into reading the picture with. You didn't have that idea. It comes later, and so you know, uh, I think that's the way to take a look at many of these texts. Maybe we're too serious when we look at them. Maybe we think that they're going to have all the answers. This includes theoretical texts as well. That they're going to
Hmm.
provide us with the tools that we want. We won't know the tools until after we read them. It should be a game. It should be discovery rather than sort of, it's work, but it's fun work and rewarding work.
I think it just doesn't translate into utilitarian principles of,
Right.
how much do I need to put into this and how much will I get out, and I should calculate that before I start. That's something that doesn't really work with these kinds of texts.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. I think you've hit it on the head. That's exactly right. The texts reward you after you're done.
Hmm.
Perhaps as you're going through, they reward you as well, but there's no promise of the reward when you begin. Once you pick up one of these texts, whether it be one of the French theorists or maybe some of the newer stuff, looking at, I've done some work in gender theory. You take a look at something by Judith Butler, and you think that you're going to have all the answers when you start.
Yeah.
She might have all the answers, but I suspect that you won't when you're done.
Yeah.
I don't think I don't think it's healthy necessarily to think that we're going to have all of the tools or all of the answers once we finish once we go into this work.
Yeah, and I mean, in fact, maybe we'll have more questions, but I think they'll be better questions if you're reading a good text. Uh,
Yeah.
what questions do you still have, or what questions would you like to answer if you had the opportunity to work on this further about Bowie? What questions would you still like to explore?
One of the things I want to do, and I'm not sure if I'll ever get the chance to do this, but I would really like to look at Bowie's career. I would still sort of like to look at things a little newer, and I think that's because my experience with David Bowie is a newer experience. Like my sister had a copy of Let's Dance, and that was my first time listening to Bowie, and that's the early 1980s. And I only bought my own Bowie CD in 1993. That was the first, Black Tie, White Noise was the first one I bought. And so I would like to take a look at this later career through the lens of Black Star. And in some ways, it's a bit of a theoretical kind of study, but I'd like to see what Black Star might tell us about what happened before. I guess I'm still looking for this link. I don't see these periods as sort of distinct and disjointed. I see them as a kind of spectrum or whatever. I see them as a journey, and
Hmm.
so I want to take a look at the old stuff through the lens of Black Star because I really think that the 7 tracks of Black Star, it's a very powerful work and an important work, and I want to see what happens if I take a look at that older stuff through this lens. I'm also hoping to focus a shorter book, if I could, at some point on Let's Dance, just because it was such a popular album. It was probably his most popular in terms of commercial popularity, and I'd like to take a look at it. It's praised because it was so commercially popular, but it's maligned as well because it was so commercially popular. And so I'd like to take a look at that, a more serious approach, and perhaps see if I can map out what brought Bowie to that point, maybe musically or thematically or ideologically or whatever, and how that album then informed what he did directly after in the 80s. And those are even more maligned albums, the couple that came out during the 80s. People hate them, right? They're the worst things ever. But I think that there are some gems in those albums as well. Um, Maybe if you want, there are some cracks in the celebrity there where we get to see this real Bowie. He's got a real commercial sheen in the 1980s, but there's a few of these songs like "Time Will Crawl" and so forth that seem to break that a little bit, and you see into Bowie's perhaps greater project, what he was doing throughout his life.
That reminds me of, I think, at least early on in the book, one of my favorite quotes from you is, I'll read it. You say, consider the following visual metaphor for Bowie's actions. While using his hands to shield himself from the light of the audience, Bowie makes sure that his fingers are slightly apart so that the audience can see him just a little bit. But even what they see is then hidden in shadows.
Yeah.
And so this idea of cracks in who Bowie is a really interesting thing, and I think this visual metaphor is perfect for outlining that. At least giving when I was reading it, it gave me a perfect idea of what I was getting myself into reading this book. Somehow that visual in my head as I was reading it just fit very nicely with your argument. Suddenly made it exactly clear to me,
Yeah.
to some degree, what I would be reading and how and what to expect from that. I'm just curious how you came upon that. Like, what was it that made you see that and put that in as a visual metaphor, effectively for what you're talking about throughout?
I think, I don't know where I got that image itself from. I think it's probably a mix of a few things. It's from Bowie's own performance style. In a performance that he did on David Letterman's show, he turned his back to the crowd, and for me that was a big deal that he actually turned himself away from the crowd completely. The crowd that was there basically to watch him perform, he turned away from a TV audience, and that was um, a pretty charged sort of thing to do. And also, there's a video that accompanies his album from the early 2000s, Reality, And in that video, he's bathed in blue light. And so while we see him in this blue light, he's actually not visible to us very much at all. And I think it was a melding of these kinds of images that I sort of came up with this notion that, Bowie is there, but he's deflecting our gaze. While he's deflecting our gaze, we get to see a little bit of him. We don't see all of him, though. We just see a little bit. And then, like I've written there, what we do see is still sort of in the shadows.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad that you like it. That makes me feel good inside. And hopefully it's a useful image that we could apply to, all of the celebrities that we might encounter. I think that the real Bowie is there somewhere, and maybe we see cracks of it, or we see cracks toward that truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so exciting to find those cracks.
Yeah. Well, and I do, especially I think lately, look for metaphors that help people think or understand. I'm constantly, I guess, looking for images that will help me explain certain theories if I'm teaching, something like that. Is there a sort of metaphor that you think about in terms of what you're doing, either in that particular case or more generally? I mean, I know some scholars will talk about sort of digging, right? Like digging below the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Other scholars see themselves more as, bricoleurs, right? Putting things together from what is available to them.
Yeah.
And I find that most people have an implicit sort of metaphor for what they do. Sometimes people have really thought about it and they have an explicit one. But when you think about what you do metaphorically, is there something that comes to mind? Are you digging? Are you building? Are you exploring as an explorer, or what do you think? What do you think it is?
I think I'm exploring and I'm playing. A lot of times, the text that I look at it like an opaque piece of glass. That's the text. The truth of the text is somewhere behind that piece of glass, and I don't see it exactly, but I see some of it maybe. And when I take all of the tools that I have around me, some of it is play, right? I'll find something and I'll see if it fits.
Mm-hmm.
I'll find something else and see if I could work with it. And if I've got my problem, I'll just, the first thing I would do is I would go to, okay, I want to write about this. Well, what can I do? How can I write about this? Well, let me just pick something up, and I'll pick it up and I'll start reading it and I'll start jotting notes down. And I'll say, yeah, I could use this. This is good. Or pretty quickly, usually I realize, well, yeah, this is really too far outside of what I'm wanting to do. This is not going to work. So it's not just a completely haphazard sort of exercise. But I'll take that stuff and try to see if it'll work to understand what's behind this opaque piece of glass. And as I'm doing that, maybe some things will become more clear, but maybe I'll just see myself a little more in this opaque piece of glass. I'm seeing reflections of myself. And so as I'm working, I'm revealing a little bit of what's going on behind the glass. I'm giving you a case for what I see there behind the glass. But in many ways, what I'm doing is I'm also showing you how I am, what makes me up, because I'm giving you my perspective on things. When you read the book on Bowie, in many ways you're seeing Bowie. I'm revealing a little bit of that truth to you,
Mm-hmm.
but in many ways I'm revealing who I am to you as well. So, I'm playing around, and one of the costs of me playing around is that you get to see a little bit more of who I am too.
Yeah, that's, I think, another interesting thing that we probably don't express enough to, especially to students, is that you don't have to be an invisible entity.
Right.
I often am surprised that people ask me if they can use the word I in essays, for example, because they've been trained, I guess, in high school or maybe other places that they have to pretend basically not to exist. I guess that makes it more true, more factual if there's nobody behind these ideas.
Yeah, and I get that question all the time, and I usually say yes, you can. I think I always tell them that they, of course, can put themselves into the text. Interestingly, I hardly ever put myself into the text.
Literally, you mean not? You don't say I.
I don't say I. Yeah, but I do put myself in the text.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks for clarifying that for me, Chris. I'm all over the place in that text. That text is me. I just don't use I in there, but that text is me. I mean, in many ways, it's a mirror on who I am. The book is just as much me as it is David Bowie. That's just the cost of it, right? For me, that's I've paid that into it. It is me. So I mean, I don't like to tell people that necessarily because I'm not sure people want to read a book about me necessarily. That's just a byproduct. But for me, it's a cost. I'm actually putting myself out there as well, just as much as trying to reveal some truth about David Bowie. I also get to learn about myself.
And I think that's why we're drawn to people like David Bowie's, because especially someone like him who's so versatile and has so many different possible interpretations, I think anyone can look at him and see something of themselves in him,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Or
So,
at least something that we want to be as well. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
if I don't see myself in Bowie, I certainly would want to be like him in certain things. I'm
yeah.
always fascinated by people who are celebrities in particular who can control themselves. They have a control over their presence, over the way that they move. I never had very good control. If you've seen me in person, so you know that this is true. And I'm always fascinated by that. And I think Bowie is a prime example. The way he would stand on stage was so controlled, and it's just so attractive to me that someone had such control over themselves. So in many ways, I want to be like that. Not that I want to be aloof and sort of be a mystery to people. I'm not really that kind of guy,
Hmm.
but I would love to have that level of control over myself. Um, Again, physical control over myself. It seems sort of a very surface thing to think, but yeah, the celebrities give us things that one of the reasons why we desire them or to follow them is because there's something in them that we like. And so, yeah, I think it's an important study, and for me, Bowie was a natural place to go
Hmm.
for this.
Well, I think I got everything that I was looking for. Did you have any other ideas or comments that you wanted to add?
No, I think that's all. I think this has been a great talk, and I'm certainly happy to talk about David Bowie, Roland Barthes, and critical theory. I think that it's perhaps an area of study that fewer people are really getting interested in. On the one hand, because it's not utilitarian. I think at least the utility isn't so easily identified. And so
Hmm.
I think we need to sort of help people to understand that this stuff is really important to understand life and to understand the nature of ourselves.